The thing they never tell you about long-haul trucking. The thing you can't learn from any manual or from some grizzled old-timer sucking down coffee outside a diner that smells of grease and regret is the specific, suffocating quality of the darkness out there on the empty stretches. It ain't just an absence of light. It's a presence, a heavy velvet blackness that settles over the cab after midnight, pressing in on the windows, swallowing the white lines of the highway hole until you feel like you're not moving at all, but are instead suspended in a void. Your headlights just a tiny, lonely bubble of reality hurtling through nothing. And outside that bubble, anything is possible. I learned that lesson down to the marrow of my bones on a run through the Sonoran Desert. On a cursed stretch of asphalt the old-timers call the Azrael Highway. My name's Leo. I've been piloting this 18-wheeler for going on 12 years now. I've seen blizzards in the Rockies that'd freeze the devil's tail, blinding Cajun rains in Louisiana that turned the interstates into rivers. And I've pushed through the kind of tired that makes a man see things that ain't there, dancing, shadows in the periphery, faces in the patterns of the road grit on the windshield. Or at least things you hope ain't there. This run, though, this was different. It had a weight to it from the start. The load was routine, a bunch of store fixtures, metal shelving and checkout counters, bound for a new big box place opening just outside Phoenix. I was running late on account of a shredded tire outside El Paso that cost me 4 precious hours, and the dispatch was breathing down my neck, their voices over the phone tinny and frantic. The only way to make up the time, to save the contract and my hide, was to take the shortcut, the Azrael, a notorious 2-lane blacktop that cuts through the emptiest part of the desert, saving 3 hours but costing you, they say, a piece of your sanity. Veteran drivers swap stories about it in hushed tones over lukewarm beer. Trucks break down for no mechanical reason, their engines dead and cold as stone. CB radios fill with a static that sounds like whispering, and sometimes clear, frantic voices that ain't quite human. And some guys just vanish. They find the rig, engine still ticking as it cools, logbook open and pen lying right there, a half-eaten sandwich on the passenger seat. But no driver, never a trace. I told myself it was all superstition, the kind of campfire nonsense that grows in places where the cell service dies and the only company you have for 200 miles is the voice in your own head. I was a modern man, a man of diesel and steel, not ghost stories. So, as the sun began to bleed out over the western mountains, painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and purple, I pointed my Peterbilt's grill onto the on-ramp and committed myself to the darkness. The first hour was fine, almost peaceful. The desert at night has a severe, beautiful kind of loneliness to it. The sky is a blanket of stars so thick and bright it looks like God spilled a sack of diamonds across black velvet. My radio was scanning, catching snippets of a mournful country song from somewhere, a right-wing talk show host ranting from another, both fading in and out like distant memories. Then, right around midnight, it all died. It didn't fade. It was cut. 1 second there was a twangy guitar solo, the next, nothing. Not even the hiss of static. Just a dead, hollow silence, a vacuum of sound that felt heavier than any noise. I fiddled with the knobs, smacked the side of the unit like an old TV, but nothing. It was like something had just reached out and swallowed all the signals out of the air, leaving me in perfect isolated silence. That's when I saw the first flicker of light in my side mirror. A single bright, unwavering pinprick way back there in the consuming black. My heart, which had been clenched from the radio dying, gave a little thump of relief. I figured it was another truck. Some other fool brave or desperate enough to take the Azrael. I was almost glad for the company, for the proof that I wasn't the last man on Earth. But the light stayed at the same exact distance for a long, long time. Not gaining, not falling back. Just pacing me. A silent, unblinking companion. I started paying more attention, my eyes flicking from the road to the mirror more and more frequently. That light was always there, a steady, malevolent eye in the gloom. A little experiment. I slowed down, letting off the throttle to maybe 70, pretending to check a non-existent map. The light slowed with me, perfectly matching my speed. My throat went dry. I sped up, pushing my rig to a shaky 85, the trailer swaying ominously behind me. The light kept pace, effortlessly, without ever seeming to hurry. A cold knot began to tighten in my gut. This wasn't another driver. Drivers don't do that. About an hour later, the knot pulled tight into a full-blown cramp of fear. The light in the mirror started to get brighter. It was closing the distance, and it was closing it fast. My hands were slick with sweat on the wheel. I stomped on the accelerator, the diesel engine roaring in a deep-throated protest. The needle climbed 90-95. I was flying, the desert a monochrome blur outside my windows, the yellow center line a solid streak. I risked a glance in the mirror and my blood turned to ice water in my veins. The light was still gaining, impossibly fast. And now I could see it wasn't a single headlight. It was a pair. 2 points of searing actinic white light, mounted too close together, too high off the ground to be a car or a truck. They were wrong, alien, and then it was on me. It didn't whoosh past with a roar of wind. 1 second it was 100 yards back. The next it was right on my tail, flooding my cab with a brutal, blinding white light that erased the darkness and left purple afterimages on my retinas. I squinted, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal. I couldn't see what was behind those lights. There was just an impression of a shape, a hulking, black mass that was deeper than the surrounding night, a silhouette that blotted out the stars behind it. It had no discernible features, no grille, no windshield, no markings. Just a solid wall of darkness and those two terrible, piercing eyes. It rode my bumper for what felt like an eternity, maybe 10 miles. The pressure in the cab was immense. A physical weight pushing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The air grew cold. So cold I could see my own panicked breath pluming in the hostile glare. I could feel it, a malice. An ancient, patient intelligence that was as old as the desert itself. This wasn't some lost ghost or a random spook. This was something that belonged to this road, to this specific darkness, and I was an intruder in its domain, a mouse scurrying across the floor of a cathedral. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. The lights didn't fade or recede. They winked out of existence. The pressure lifted so abruptly, I felt like I might float out of my seat. The cab warmed up almost instantly, the lingering chill the only proof it had ever been there. I was alone again, shaking so hard my teeth were chattering, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I pulled over onto the narrow shoulder, the gravel crunching loudly under my tires, a terrifyingly normal sound. I killed the engine and just sat there, breathing in ragged, gulping sobs, listening to the tink-tink-tink of the cooling engine. The silence outside was absolute. No crickets, no wind rustling the sagebrush, nothing. It was the silence of a tomb. That's when I heard it. A new sound, a faint rhythmic thump-thump-thump. It was coming from the back of the trailer. My first sane thought was that I had a loose tie-down, a strap flapping in the wind. But I'd checked that load twice back in El Paso. Everything was battened down, secure. This was different. It was too deliberate, too intelligent. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't frantic. It was patient, like a fist, politely but insistently knocking on the other side of the trailer's thick, reinforced rear doors. I am not a coward. I faced down road rage, held my own in a bar fight or two, and I once drove through a tornado warning in Oklahoma. But sitting in that silent, dark cab, with the memory of those non-headlights burned into my vision, that knocking was the most terrifying sound I have ever heard. It was a sound that should not exist. I had my CB mic in my hand, my thumb on the button, ready to scream for help, for anyone, into the dead air. But I didn't, because a worse thought occurred to me, a thought that froze the words in my throat. What if something answered? The knocking stopped. Just like that. I held my breath, my entire body tensed, waiting. For a full 5 minutes, there was nothing but the pounding of my own heart in my ears. Maybe it was over. Maybe it was just the stress, the fatigue, the desert playing tricks on me. I let out a long, shaky sigh, the kind that comes from the very bottom of your soul, and reached for the keys to start the engine. The CB radio crackled to life. It wasn't static. It was a voice. But it wasn't human. It was a distorted, digital-sounding garble, like a text-to-speech program fed through a meat grinder and played backwards. It was slow, each word stretched and twisted, devoid of any real emotion, yet dripping with a sinister intent. Lou. My name. It said my name. I froze, my fingers an inch from the ignition. my blood turning to slush in my veins. How did it know? The voice came again, that synthetic malevolence carving itself into my mind. Don't go. We're not down talking. I slammed the key into the ignition, twisted it so hard I thought it might snap, and the big diesel rumbled to life. I didn't care about the load. I didn't care about dispatch. I didn't care about anything but getting out of that specific spot on the highway. I threw it into gear and pulled back onto the asphalt, stomping on the gas so hard the tires chirped on the pavement. I didn't look in the mirror. I didn't want to see what was behind me or beside me or worse, what was now inside the trailer with my shipment. For the next 30 miles, I drove in a blind, sheer panic. The knocking didn't return. The radio was silent. The road was empty. The initial sharp edge of my terror began to wear down into a dull, throbbing dread. I started to think maybe I'd broken whatever spell the Azrael had cast. Maybe I was in the clear. The first faint hints of dawn were a gray smear on the horizon ahead, a promise of salvation. Hope, frail and desperate, began to bloom in my chest. And then I saw the sign, an old, battered, bullet-riddled mile marker. I'd passed it an hour ago, right before the lights first appeared. I was sure of it. The same 3 bullet holes in a tight cluster. The same faded numbers barely visible in my headlights. My hope curdled into pure, unadulterated dread. I was driving in a circle, but that was impossible. The Azrael Highway was a straight shot, a ruler line on the map. There were no turns, no off-ramps, no intersections. The geography itself was lying. I pushed on, my eyes darting from the road to the fuel gauge. I was running dangerously low. The needle was buried deep in the red, far lower than it should have been. I should have had another 150 miles in the tank. It was like the darkness itself was sipping my diesel, drinking my hope along with my fuel. That's when the fog rolled in. It didn't creep in on little cat feet. It poured over the desert floor like a tidal wave, a thick, soupy, unnatural bank of vapor that swallowed the road in seconds, reducing my world to the 20 feet of pavement visible in front of my hood. I was forced to slow to a crawl, maybe 20 miles an hour. The fog had a strange, coppery smell to it, like old blood and ozone, the smell of the air right after a lightning strike. And then the shapes began to form in the mist beside the highway. Tall, slender, humanoid shadows that kept pace with my truck, gliding effortlessly through the scrub. They had no details, no faces, but I could feel them watching me, their attention a physical pressure. They were the things that lived in the silence between the radio stations, the things that waited in the emptiness between the stars, and they were now letting me see them. One of the shapes drifted closer, emerging from the wall of fog to run alongside my driver's side door. It was a man, or something that had once been a man. His skin was pale and waxy like a candle. His eyes were wide and completely vacant, and he was dressed in faded denim and a classic trucker's hat. He wasn't running. His legs didn't move. He was just gliding, keeping perfect unhurried pace with my truck. His mouth was hung open in a silent, endless scream, and I recognized him. I'd seen his face on a faded missing person's flyer tacked to a corkboard at a truck stop in Tucson years ago. A driver named Jerry Jukebox Walsh, who'd disappeared on this very highway a decade back. He lifted a hand, slow and deliberate, and pointed a single bony finger directly at me. Then he slowly turned his hand and pointed ahead, down the road I was trapped on. His message was clear, a verdict delivered in silence. "Your turn. You're one of us now," I screamed. I couldn't help it. It was a raw animal sound of terror and fury, ripped from a place inside me I didn't know existed. I slammed my fist on the steering wheel, on the dash. "Leave me alone!" I roared into the fog-shrouded cab, my voice cracking with the strain. And as if in answer to my defiance, the fog directly in front of me began to thin. There was no gradual transition. One second, it was an impenetrable white wall. The next, it parted like a stage curtain being pulled back, revealing a single solitary figure standing rigidly in the middle of my lane. So close, I had only a second to react. It was a woman. She was wearing a thin, tattered white nightgown, stained with dirt and something darker that looked like old rust or blood. Her feet were bare and caked with grime. Her long black hair was stringy and wet, plastered to her shoulders and back. She was facing away from me, perfectly, unnaturally still. I stood on the brakes, the air brakes hissing and screaming. The trailer lurching violently, threatening to jackknife and turn me into a twisted metal coffin. I was going to hit her. There was no way to stop in time. At the last possible second, just before my grill would have smashed into her, she began to turn her head. It rotated slowly, mechanically, a full 180 degrees, far further than a human neck should allow. Her face came into view, pale and gaunt, the skin stretched tight over her skull, and she had no eyes, just smooth, unbroken skin where her eyes should have been. And then she smiled. A wide, horrific, impossibly large grin that split her face from ear to ear, filled with small, sharp-pointed teeth. It was a smile of welcome and of ownership. I closed my eyes, bracing for the sickening impact, praying it would be quick. It never came. When I opened them, the road was clear. The fog was gone as if it had never been. The sun was properly rising now, painting the desert in beautiful, normal hues of orange and pink. I was parked crookedly across both lanes, the engine shuddering. I looked around, wild-eyed, hyperventilating. Nothing. No woman, no shapes, no fog. I was alone on a perfectly normal, sun-drenched stretch of highway. A road sign a little ways ahead read, "Phoenix, 50 miles." The nightmare was over. I don't know how I made it the rest of the way. I was running on pure shredded adrenaline and primal fear. I pulled into the distribution center, handed over the paperwork with a hand that wouldn't stop trembling, and didn't say a word to the foreman. I just needed to get that trailer off my rig, to sever the connection, as they were backing it into the receiving dock. One of the warehouse guys came out, looking puzzled. "Hey, driver," he said, scratching his head. "You know your rear door is scratched all to hell?" "Looks like a bear got after it." I forced my legs to carry me to the back of the trailer. The heavy, reinforced metal doors were covered in deep, parallel gouges. They started at the bottom and went all the way to the top, as if something with long, sharp, powerful claws had scaled the doors, trying to get out or maybe trying to get in. And in the center of the left door, scratched into the paint with terrible force, was a single crude symbol. It looked like a circle with a line slashed through it. The universal symbol for no, forbidden, a warning, or a brand. I never went back for that trailer. I quit my job over the phone that same afternoon. I sold my rig at a massive loss and used the money to move back east, to a small town in Virginia as far from the desert as I could get. I work in a hardware store now. I sleep with the lights on. I haven't driven at night since. Most folks, they hear a story like this and they laugh. They nod and say it was sleep deprivation, a complex hallucination brought on by stress and loneliness, and the monotony of the white line. And maybe they're right. Maybe my mind just broke out there in the darkness, and everything was just a figment of a fractured psyche. But late at night, when the wind is just right and whistles through a crack in the window, or when the power flickers for a second and plunges the room into blackness, I remember the feel of that unnatural cold in my cab. I remember the sound of that patient, intelligent knocking. I remember the smooth, eyeless face and that grinning, hungry mouth. And I know, with a certainty that chills my soul and keeps me locked in this small, well-lit town, that the Azrael Highway doesn't just show you what you're afraid of. It shows you what's real. It shows you what's waiting in the dark. Just outside that little bubble of light we all pretend is the whole world, waiting for its next passenger. And it's always, always hungry.